Somewhere under the pavements of one of the busiest cities on earth, there is a wooden writing tablet with a date scratched into it. The 8th of January, in the year 57. A note about money, written by someone whose name we know, in a city that had only just been built. That tablet spent 19 centuries in wet mud, and it is only one of hundreds. Tonight we are going to spend a long, slow while in London. Not the London of maps and monuments, but the older one underneath. We will meet a bakery on a narrow lane, and a bridge with houses leaning over the water, and a child wading in river mud at low tide looking for copper nails. We will find out what people ate, what they were afraid of, and what made them laugh. There is no rush. Nothing here needs to be remembered. If you find this channel a gentle place to drift off, you are always welcome to subscribe. It quietly helps. But that is all I will say about it. Now let yourself settle. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves all day. And picture a river. Not the river as it is now, narrow and walled in stone. Picture it wide and shallow, and braided into channels, spreading through reeds and mudflats, the water gray-brown and moving slowly toward the sea, gulls somewhere out over it. Nothing built, nothing named. There is a low ridge of gravel on the north bank, dry ground above the marsh. In time, a street will run along it. In time, that street will be paved and repaved and paved again, each new surface laid over the last, until the road you could walk today sits nearly 6 meters above the one the first people used. And somewhere on that street, eventually, there will be a window with a candle in it, looking out over the stones. We will keep coming back to that candle, and to the river underneath everything. Far off, so faint you might be imagining it, there is a bell ringing through fog. Somewhere below, hooves on wet stone, and from a doorway, the smell of bread in an oven, at the hour before dawn. Let those stay with you. Here is the first thing. The river was here long before anyone thought to give it a city. For thousands of years, the Thames simply ran through empty land, and it did not look the way it looks now. It was far wider, in places 3 or 4 times as wide, and shallow enough in the right season that you might have waded a good distance out into it. It spread into side channels and marsh and islands of firmer ground. At low tide, it left a vast expanse of soft gray mud that steamed slightly in cold weather. Think of it less as a river and more as a wide, flat valley, with water lying across the bottom of it, moving. And it was tidal. Twice a day, the sea pushed up from the east, slowing the flow, lifting the level, then drawing back out again and leaving everything glistening. That rhythm was there before any human being stood on the bank. It is still there tonight, right now, whether anyone is watching or not. Everything that follows, every bridge, every fire, every crowd, happened on the edges of that slow breathing in and out. Which raises a quiet question. If nobody had built anything here yet, who gave the river its name? Nobody knows. And that is the interesting part. The word Thames is older than English. It is older than Latin in Britain. It appears to be older than the Celtic languages that were spoken here when the Romans arrived, which means it may have survived, passed mouth to mouth, from people whose language is entirely lost to us. The oldest form we can reach is something like Thamesis, and the best guess at its meaning is simply the dark one, the dark water. Imagine that. A word handed from one generation to the next, for perhaps 3,000 years, through invasions and plagues and the total replacement of the language around it, and it never quite got dropped. People kept saying it because that was the name of the water, and you don't change the name of the water. There is something oddly comforting in it. Whole civilizations have come and gone along these banks. Their gods are forgotten, their laws are footnotes. And the thing that lasted was a single word for a river, said out loud by ordinary people who needed to tell each other where they were going. So the name is ancient, but the city is not. For a very long time, there was nothing here at all. There was no London before the Romans. This surprises people, Because most great cities grow slowly out of a village that grew out of a farm. London didn't. Before the year 43, this stretch of river had scattered farmsteads and some tracks through the woods, and a good deal of marsh, and that was more or less it. No town, no temple complex, no busy tribal center. Then a Roman army crossed the Channel, and within a few years there was a settlement here, and within 20 years it was one of the busiest ports in the northwest of the empire. That is astonishingly fast. A generation. A person could have been born in a landscape of reed beds and cattle, and died in a town of warehouses, wine imports, and shipping. Picture the very first winter. A handful of timber buildings on the gravel, smoke going up flat in the cold, the ground churned to mud between them. The nearest real city hundreds of miles away across water, and someone standing there thinking, this will work. They were right, but their reasoning had nothing to do with beauty or destiny or anything grand. It was about the ground. The Romans chose this spot for a very practical reason. It was the last place downstream where you could build a bridge, and the first place upstream where the banks were firm enough to hold one. Come inland from the sea, and the shores are marsh, soft, tidal, useless for foundations. But here, two low hills of gravel sat on the north bank, close together, with a small stream running between them into the Thames. Solid, dry, defensible ground on one side, reasonably firm gravel islands on the other, the river narrow enough to span. That's it. That is the entire origin of one of the world's great cities. Someone looked at the mud, and then looked at the gravel, and chose the gravel. Those two hills are still there, though you would never notice them now. One is Cornhill, the other is Ludgate Hill, with a cathedral sitting on top of it. The streets still rise and fall over their shapes, and people climb them every morning with coffee, complaining about the incline, entirely unaware they are walking the reason the city exists. And the little stream between them, that mattered more than anyone at the time could have guessed, because of what it did to everything that fell into it. The stream was called the Walbrook, and it is gone now, buried, built over, running through a pipe. But for 2,000 years it was quietly doing something remarkable. Its valley was waterlogged, permanently wet, heavy clay mud, and mud like that keeps oxygen out. And without oxygen, things that should rot simply don't. When archaeologists excavated a site in that valley a few years ago, ahead of a new office building, they came up with leather shoes so well preserved they looked barely worn. Sandals with the stitching intact, wooden objects, wicker, animal bone, 14,000 objects from one site, plus 81,000 fragments of bone and 73,000 pieces of pottery, and 405 wooden writing tablets. That is the strange gift of bad drainage. A Roman Londoner threw a broken sandal into a wet ditch because it was no longer any use to them, and because the ditch was foul and airless, that sandal outlasted the empire, the language, the religion, and every single person who ever knew its owner. We will come back to what was written on those tablets. It is not what you might expect. But first, the thing the settlement was built for. The bridge. There had never been one across the lower Thames before. The Romans built theirs of timber, on piles driven down into the riverbed, roughly where London Bridge stands today. And it changed everything, because a bridge is not just a way across. A bridge is a knot. Every road for 100 miles begins to bend toward it. Traffic came to the bridge, and where traffic goes, people sell things. Warehouses went up along the waterfront. Ships came upriver on the tide and tied up at wooden quays. Wine arrived in tall pottery jars from Gaul and Spain. Olive oil, fish sauce, grain going out, hides going out. Stand on the north end of it around midday, sometime in the 50s. Carts on the planks. Someone arguing about a docking fee, the smell of pitch and river mud and animals, Latin in half a dozen accents, and under it the local language, and probably a few others from the Rhineland. Within about 15 years of its founding, this raw new town on a cold northern river was worth writing home about. And then, quite suddenly, it was ash. In the year 60, or possibly 61, the settlement burned to the ground. I'll say this gently, because it is long ago and far away, and there's nothing here that needs to worry you tonight. There was a rising against Roman rule, led by a queen of the Iceni named Boudica. Her forces came south. The Roman governor, badly outnumbered, made the hard decision not to defend the town. The people who could leave, left. The town burned. What's remarkable is what that fire left behind, which is a layer of earth. Dig down in the right parts of the city today, and you pass through a distinct band of burnt red and orange material, half a meter thick in places. Oxidized clay, charred wood, melted glass, scorched grain. Archaeologists call it the destruction horizon. It is a single, terrible afternoon, turned into a stripe in the ground. Building sites hit it all the time. Someone digging foundations for a lift shaft will cut through it without ceremony, and there it is, the exact moment the First London ended, sitting in a trench under a crane. The town, though, did not stay ended. Here is how we know how fast it came back, and it comes from one of those tablets in the Walbrook mud. It is a contract, dated the 21st of October, in the year 62. A little over a year after the fire, it records an agreement to bring 20 loads of provisions from Verulamium, that's modern St. Albans, down to London, to arrive by the 13th of November. Read that again slowly. Barely 12 months after a catastrophe, somebody is already organizing cartloads of supplies on a schedule with a delivery date in writing. No speech about resilience, no monument, just a man arranging deliveries because people need feeding and there is money to be made. That is what recovery actually looks like, most of the time. Not a grand gesture, a logistics note. And it is oddly moving to think that this is what survived. Not an account of the destruction, but a receipt for 20 loads of food, written by someone who had decided the place was worth restocking. Which brings us to a question. Out of everything ever written in Roman London, what is the very earliest surviving mention of the city's own name? It's on a scrap of wood, and it is a business note. The tablet dates to somewhere between 65 and 80, and it refers to London, making it the earliest known written reference to the place, about 50 years earlier than the famous mention by the historian Tacitus that everyone used to cite. So the oldest surviving appearance of the word London is not in a poem, not in a proclamation, not carved in marble, not a founding declaration by an emperor. It is in the equivalent of a note about work. There's something wonderfully ordinary about that, and it runs right through the collection. Among those tablets there are IOUs, a judge's ruling, someone practicing the alphabet and their numerals, over and over, very possibly the earliest evidence of a school anywhere in Britain. The names of nearly 100 people, a cooper, a brewer, soldiers, freed slaves, enslaved people, merchants. A whole town's paperwork thrown in a ditch, waiting under a bank. Not one of them wrote anything down for us. They wrote it for Tuesday. And that is the thing about this river, and this hill, and this street. None of it was built to be historic. It was built because the gravel was dry and the crossing was possible, and somebody needed to move 20 loads of provisions before the middle of November. The city was an accumulation of small, practical decisions made by people who were mostly thinking about the week ahead. The layers just kept coming. Ash, then road. Road, then floor. Floor, then ash again, then road again, 6 meters of it, patient as sediment. The river carried on doing what it had always done. In and out, twice a day, dark water sliding past the wooden quays, indifferent to who owned them. Nobody down there knew they were the beginning of anything. Tomorrow morning, in a house near that first bridge, someone will get up before it is light and start work, because that is when the ovens are lit. Let's go and see what they eat. Part 2. Bread, sandals, and fish sauce. Tined in Thames. The ovens were lit before dawn, and that is how most people knew the day had started. Bakers in a Roman town worked while everyone else slept, because bread had to be ready early, and the ovens took hours to reach heat. So the first thing happening in London, every single morning, was fire being coaxed up in a stone chamber somewhere near the river, and the smell going out into a street that was otherwise dark and quiet. Their main grain was spelt wheat, not the soft white flour of a modern loaf, something denser, nuttier, browner, closer to what you might buy now in an expensive bakery and be told is artisanal. Barley grew here too, but the Romans mostly thought barley was for animals, and said so at length. The loaf that came out was heavy, round, and meant to be torn rather than sliced. And if you wanted to know exactly what else was in a London kitchen at that moment, there is a strange and slightly grim way to find out. You look at what burned. When the town went up in flames, the fire did something that no careful archaeologist could ever have arranged. It carbonized food, turned it to charcoal, sealed it under collapsing debris, and left it sitting there, unrotted, for 19 centuries. So we know there were lentils in London, in large quantities, and lentils do not grow in Britain. They came from the Mediterranean, shipped hundreds of miles, to be stored in a warehouse on a gray northern river. We know about peas and beans, walnuts and almonds, dates, damsons, wild cherry, blackberry, raspberry, carrots, beets, something in the cabbage family, anise and poppy seed, even cucumber and black cumin, which is quietly astonishing this far north. Someone was cooking with imported spices in a timber house in a town barely 20 years old. There is something very human in that. The place had no theater yet, no permanent stone forum, no certainty it would last, but somebody had made sure the seasoning arrived. And speaking of seasoning, there is one jar in particular worth telling you about. It was an amphora, a tall pottery shipping jar imported from Antibes on the southern coast of France. And when it was found, it still had mackerel heads inside it. Stamped on the outside, in effect, was the label Lucius Tedius Africanus, excellent fish sauce from Antipolis. Excellent. He had it written on the jar. This is garum, the fermented fish sauce the Romans put on more or less everything. Salty, pungent, closer to a modern Southeast Asian fish sauce than to anything in a European kitchen today. It came from Spain, from North Africa, from the south of France, in jars like this one, in ships, up the Thames, to be poured over dinner in Britain. And so a small piece of one man's marketing has survived, intact, longer than his language did. Lucius Tedius Africanus wanted you to know his sauce was the good stuff. 2,000 years later, in a museum case, he is still telling you. He would have been thrilled. He would also, I suspect, have raised the price. Most meals, though, were caught much closer to home. Eel and flounder. Those are the two that turn up again and again, and they tell you everything about what ordinary eating looked like. Eel from the Thames, from the Walbrook, from the marshy channels, flatfish from the tidal reaches, cheap, local, always there, requiring no ship and no merchant and no money changing hands across a sea. You went to the water and you got your dinner out of it. Alongside them, herring, mackerel, cod, pike, chub, trout, and then, occasionally, sturgeon, turbot. Those last two are the giveaway. Sturgeon and turbot were luxury fish, the kind that appear in Roman writing as the centerpiece of a dinner meant to impress. Finding their bones in London means that somewhere in this muddy frontier port, someone was hosting the sort of evening where the fish is supposed to be talked about. So picture two meals happening on the same night, a few streets apart. In one, eel, again as it was yesterday. In the other, turbot, arranged on a serving dish, with a host watching his guests' faces. Cities do this immediately. They have barely finished being founded, and already there is a good end of town. But there was one group whose food was different from everyone's, and we only worked this out recently. Children. In the last few years, researchers took rib bone samples from over 100 people buried in Roman London and measured the carbon and nitrogen isotopes locked inside, chemical signatures left behind by what a person actually ate. What emerged was a whole childhood, mapped out. Weaning happened before the age of 4. After that, children ate a noticeably narrower diet than adults, and a much more local one: freshwater fish, the eel and the flatfish out of the nearest water, rather than the sea fish and imported foods the adults were having. And then gradually, through the teenage years, their chemistry shifted, until by about 17, it matched an adult's completely. 17, that was the age at which the city considered you had arrived, and started feeding you like everybody else. Nobody wrote this down. No Roman author ever mentioned it. It was recovered entirely from bone, in a laboratory, 19 centuries after the last of those children finished growing up. The same care has been given to what they wore, and what they wore was mostly leather. Leatherworking was one of London's great industries, and the wet Walbrook ground has handed back the results in absurd quantities. Shoes, hundreds and hundreds of shoes, hobnailed boots for walking the roads, soft one-piece slippers, closer to a moccasin, for indoors. Openwork sandals with decorative cut patterns across the top, made by someone who cared how they looked from above, and small ones, child-sized, with the same care taken, the same neat stitching, the same hobnail patterns hammered into a sole barely longer than your hand. Some of them are worn down more on one edge than the other, the way your own shoes are worn down right now, because of how that particular person walked. That is the detail that tends to catch people, not the emperor, not the invasion. A child's shoe with the tread gone crooked, because they turned their foot slightly inward when they ran. The wardrobe holds one more surprise, and it is a genuinely odd one: 2 tiny pairs of leather briefs. They look, unmistakably, like a modern bikini bottom, cut from soft leather, laced at the hips, small enough that they were probably worn by children, though the debate has never entirely settled. They may have been worn by young acrobats or performers. They may simply have been practical underclothing for someone active. Roman art elsewhere shows women exercising in something very similar, which is why the find caused a certain amount of delighted confusion when it emerged. What I like about it is how completely it refuses to be ancient. Everything about Roman Britain in a museum tends toward the solemn: the stone inscription, the coin, the broken pot. And then there is this, a scrap of practical clothing that would look ordinary in a drawer today, laced up by somebody's hands on a cold morning in a timber house. They were not living in history. They were living on a Tuesday, getting dressed, slightly late. Some of them we can even name. There is a fragment of a carved sculpture from London showing a small child holding a ball. Just that. A little figure, and a round object in the hands, chosen by someone as the thing worth carving. And there is a stone inscription for a boy called Marcus Aurelius Eucarpus, who was 15 when he died. I want to be gentle here, because this is very old grief, and it is entirely at rest. But it is worth pausing on, because inscriptions were expensive, and someone paid for that one. Someone stood in a workshop and told a stonecutter the name and the age, and waited while it was cut, letter by letter, into stone that would outlast every person who knew him. That is what we have: a ball, a name, an age. 1900 years later, on the other side of an unrecognizable world, you are hearing his name said out loud in a language he never encountered, in a city he would not know. Which is, in its own quiet way, exactly what the stone was for. Not everyone in this town was free, and one small piece of wood says so plainly. It is a writing tablet recording the sale of a girl named Fortunata from Gaul. It gives her name, where she came from, and the terms of the transaction, in the flat administrative language that such documents always use. She was a person, and the document treats her as property, and both of those things are true at once on the same piece of wood. I mention her because she was here. She walked these same streets, past the bakeries, past the leather workers, in shoes very much like the ones we have found, and the only reason we know she existed at all is a piece of paperwork written by someone with no interest whatsoever in her inner life. Most of Roman London was people like Fortunata, rather than people like the governor. The town ran on them. The records almost never say so, but occasionally, by accident, one survives. And they came from everywhere. The gravestones and dedications name a merchant from Antioch, in what is now Turkey, a man born in Athens. A dedication from a Gaulish citizen who described himself with the Celtic word moritix, seafarer. Isotope studies have found people buried in London who grew up in Germany, in the southern Mediterranean, in North Africa, and people of African ancestry who had grown up right here, in London, from childhood, whose bones carry the local water and the local food. So the very first version of this city was already a place where you could hear several languages before breakfast, and no one thought it worth remarking on. Somewhere on that gravel street above the river, a lamp burns in a window. Inside, someone is speaking a language that came here by ship, to a child born within a mile of the Thames, who will grow up speaking something else entirely. Out in the dark, faintly, hooves on wet stone. All those voices, and almost none of them written down, except, as it turns out, rather more of them than anyone expected. Part 3. Voices in the Wax. A Roman writing tablet was not paper. It was a small rectangle of wood with a shallow recess cut into the face of it, and that recess was filled with beeswax, blackened with soot. You wrote by scratching into the wax with a metal stylus, pointed at one end, flattened at the other. The flat end was your eraser. Smooth the wax over, and the words vanish and the tablet is new again. People carried them the way you might carry a notebook, accounts, letters, contracts, reminders, which creates an obvious problem 2,000 years later. The wax does not survive, not 1 gram of it. Everything anybody actually intended to write is gone completely, dissolved out of the ground long ago. What survives is the wood underneath. And here is the accident that gives us everything. Sometimes, if a person pressed a little too hard, the stylus went through the wax and left a faint scratch in the wooden base beneath. Not on purpose, just pressure. So we are not reading Roman London's writing. We are reading the places where somebody leaned on the pen. It gets harder, because the tablets were reused over and over for years. A merchant writes an account in January, smooths the wax, writes a letter in March, smooths it again, writes a receipt in June. Each time, a few strokes go through into the wood. And so what you eventually recover from the mud is a single wooden surface carrying the faint ghosts of dozens of unrelated documents, all scratched on top of one another, at every angle, in no order. Imagine a window that has been written on with a fingertip 100 times, then breathed on. Reading that is not really reading, it is closer to untangling. The man who did most of it, Roger Tomlin, worked with raking light, a lamp held almost flat against the surface, so that a scratch a fraction of a millimeter deep throws a shadow long enough to see. Turn the light, and a different set of marks appears. Turn it again, another. 405 tablets came out of that site. Over 80 have been deciphered. Before them, the total number of legible Roman writing tablets known from London was 19. The oldest dated document in Britain, the earliest handwritten thing we can point to and give a day, is one of them. The 8th of January, in the year 57. It is about money. Of course it is. A financial note, in the ordinary language of business, written by someone with no idea they were setting a record. Consider where London was on that morning. 10 years old maybe, a timber port on a northern river, 3 years away from being burned to the ground and not knowing it. The wooden bridge in place, ships on the tide, frost most likely on the mud. And in a room somewhere, a man scratching a date and a sum into blackened wax on the 2nd week of January, which even now is the flattest, grayest, most administrative week of the year. 19 centuries of everything, and the very first dated document from this island is a person doing their accounts in early January. Some things about this city have simply never changed. Then there is the tablet that has nothing on it at all, in the sense that matters, and it may be the most touching object in the entire collection. Someone was practicing. The alphabet, written out, numerals written out, letters formed carefully, then formed again, the way you do when the shape of them is not yet automatic in your hand. That is very probably the earliest evidence of a school anywhere in Britain, not a building, not a named teacher, or a curriculum, or a founder's inscription, just a piece of wood on which a person who could not yet write was learning to. We do not know whether they were a child or an adult. It might have been a boy being trained up for the family business. It might have been a grown man who had built a life on the docks and decided he was tired of needing other people to read things to him. Either way, they got better. And the tablet where they were still getting it wrong is the thing that lasted. One name on the tablets made historians sit up, because they already knew it: Julius Classicus. He appears in London as the prefect of the 6th cohort of Nervians, a serving officer, doing unremarkable administrative business in the first decades of the city. Years later, Classicus would help lead the Batavian Revolt, a major uprising on the Rhine frontier that shook Roman control of the region and very nearly split the Northwestern Empire apart. He is a figure in the histories, a name in the story of Rome's near disaster. And here he is beforehand, a middling officer stationed in a damp river port on the edge of everything, signing off on paperwork. Nobody in London had any idea. He was simply the prefect, someone whose signature you needed, someone you might have to wait around for. The tablets are full of this quiet effect. History arrives later, and by then everyone who was actually standing in the room has gone home. Nearly 100 people are named across the collection, and it is the ordinariness of the list that undoes you. A cooper, a barrel maker, a brewer, a judge, soldiers, freedmen, meaning people who had been enslaved and were no longer, enslaved people, named in documents about themselves, merchants and moneylenders, and the people who owed them. Most of the names suggest origins in Gaul and the Rhineland, which fits everything else we know. This was a town of arrivals, built by people who had come from somewhere else and were making it work. They lend each other money, they chase debts, they confirm deliveries, they complain, mildly and formally, about being messed around. One tablet is essentially a man writing to say that he has been made to look foolish in front of others over an unpaid sum, and would like this resolved. 2,000 years. Nothing about that feeling has moved a single inch. They wrote none of it for us. That is what makes it real. And then, in February of last year, London did what London does, and handed over something enormous with no warning at all. An office block on Gracechurch Street was due for demolition. Archaeologists knew roughly where the Roman Civic Center had stood, so they went into the basement and cut small test pits through the concrete floor to check. The third pit was dug between 2 filing cabinets. It hit Roman masonry. They widened it. The masonry kept going. What they had found was the foundation of London's first basilica, not a church in this period, but the great public hall where the town's decisions were made. Judgments handed down, contracts registered, disputes settled. Limestone quarried in Kent, flint and tile, foundations a meter wide, walls still standing 4 meters high, beneath a floor that people had been walking across for 90 years without knowing. The building above it was full of desks and paperwork, and everyone assumed the interesting part of that address was on the upper floors. Here is the part that makes me laugh, gently. That basilica, the first one, this enormous stone statement of civic seriousness, built around the year 80, stood for roughly 20 or 30 years. Then they knocked it down. Not because it failed, because London had grown so fast that within a generation it was too small. The replacement was around 5 times larger. Somebody spent a fortune on a building meant to say, "This is a permanent city now," and lived long enough to watch it demolished for being inadequate. There is a whole character sketch of this place in that single fact, not sentimental, not precious about its own monuments. London has spent 2,000 years knocking down the previous version of itself with barely a pause, and this was the very first time it did so. The rubble of the first basilica was simply left in the ground, under the courtyard of the second, which is why it was still there. under the filing cabinets, waiting. The city has slowly developed a habit of putting these things on display exactly where they were found. In 1988, archaeologists working under the Guildhall found the Roman amphitheater, the arena, the entrance passage, the drains. It is there now beneath the art gallery, viewable underground, with the outline of the full oval traced in dark stone across the courtyard above, so you can stand in the middle of the ring at street level. The Temple of Mithras, found in the Walbrook mud in the 1950s, sits in the basement of the Bloomberg Building, the same excavation that produced the tablets, restored to roughly its original spot, presented in low light and drifting sound. And the Gracechurch Street Basilica is to be preserved and open to the public inside the new tower going up over it. A glass floor, a lift down, office workers eating lunch above a courtroom that stopped being used 1700 years ago. That is the shape of this city, and it will hold for everything still to come tonight. Nothing here gets cleared away properly. It gets built over, and the previous thing settles into the dark and waits, sometimes for 2,000 years, until somebody needs a deeper basement. The street on the gravel ridge above the river kept rising, layer on layer. Ash, floor, road, floor. 6 meters of accumulated ordinary days. And in the wet ground below it, the wooden tablets lay in the mud of a buried stream. 100 names, one man's practiced alphabet, a note about money written on the 8th of January, none of them saying anything they thought was worth keeping. The candle in the window burns down and is replaced. The bell sounds somewhere out in the fog. Then, for a long while, something happens to this city that almost nobody expects. Everybody leaves. Part 4. The city that was left empty. Nobody quite knows when the last person walked out. Through the early 5th century, Roman authority in Britain unraveled. The coin supply dried up, the army thinned, the administration stopped functioning. It was not a single event. It was a slow-going quiet, over perhaps 2 generations, the way a house empties when the family gradually stops coming back to it. By around the year 457, London appears to have been essentially abandoned. Not sacked, not burned, just left. And then, for something close to 200 years, there is no evidence that anyone lived inside those walls at all. 2 centuries, longer than the United States has existed. A walled Roman city with paved streets, a forum, a basilica, an amphitheater, warehouses, a bridge, sitting there in the weather with nobody in it. That is one of the strangest things that has ever happened to this place, and it is not really explicable in the way people want it to be. Picture the first summer of it. The streets are still perfectly good, buildings still standing, roofs still on, doors still on their hinges. Someone's cooking pot still where they left it, because you don't take everything. Then the second summer. Grass in the joints between the paving stones, a gutter blocked with leaves, and water going where water should not go. Then 5 years. 10. Roof tiles slipping, a beam giving way, and a floor coming down into the room below. Brambles across a doorway. Birds nesting in a public hall where judgments used to be handed down. Then 50 years, and the paved roads are under soil, and saplings are growing through the amphitheater, and the wooden bridge, untended, unrepaired, has rotted at the piles and gone into the river. There is nobody to be sad about any of this. That is the part that sits oddly. Ruin usually implies a witness. For a long time, there was almost no one to watch. There were people in the wider landscape, though. They were simply choosing not to live there. Over these centuries, settlers arrived from what is now northern Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark, the people we call the Anglo-Saxons. Their cemeteries turn up around the edges of modern London, Mitcham, Croydon, Greenwich, Hanwell. Around the edges, not inside. They knew the city was there. They went in, to scavenge stone, to take metal, to look. And then they came back out and lived somewhere else. The usual explanations are practical. Their way of life was rural, and their buildings were timber, A stone city with a street grid and a market economy was not a thing they had any use for. Roman towns needed Roman systems, taxation, supply, coinage, and those systems had gone. But there may have been something else in it too, because we have a hint of what those ruins felt like to them. An Old English poet, looking at the remains of a Roman city in Britain, called them enta geweork, the work of giants. That phrase turns up more than once in the surviving poetry, and it is not a throwaway. These were people living in wooden halls, and around them stood enormous structures of cut stone that nobody now alive could build, that no one remembered building, standing in a landscape where the skill to make them had simply disappeared. Not ancient history to them, just there, enormous, mossy, roofless, and entirely unexplained. The most famous of these poems, describing a ruined Roman town, is a long meditation on exactly that feeling, the walls still standing, the builders long gone, the whole thing outlasting everyone who understood it. So when we say the Saxons avoided the Roman city, it may not have been only about drainage and taxes. It may have felt like a place that belonged to somebody else. Meanwhile, about a mile to the west, something new was quietly getting started. From around the year 600, a settlement grew along the north bank of the Thames, outside the walls, in the area between what is now Covent Garden and the Strand, stretching west toward Trafalgar Square and east toward Aldwych. It was called Londonwyck. The name kept the old Roman word and added an Old English ending, wick, meaning trading town. You can hear the same ending still, all over the map: Greenwich, Woolwich, Ipswich. And it prospered. For roughly 250 years, this was London. Not the walled city, this. Which means there is a stretch of several centuries in which the actual, functioning, populated London was somewhere entirely different from where everybody assumes it was, and archaeologists did not work this out until the 1980s. They had been digging in the wrong place for decades and finding almost nothing. The reason Londonwyck sat where it did is written into the street name, and most people walk down it without hearing it. The Strand. Strand means beach, shore, the edge where water meets land. Because Londonwyck had no stone quays and no deep water docks, ships were run straight up onto the foreshore at high tide, unloaded onto the mud, and floated off again when the water came back. The Strand was, quite literally, the beach they were pulled up onto. In 1988, excavators found the riverside embankments the town had built, wood and wattle, branches woven together and packed with clay, laid down to make a stable working edge along a soft shore. That is the whole port. Woven branches and mud and the tide. And on that beach, according to a monk writing in the early 700s, arrived goods from half of Europe. Bede described Londonwyck as an emporium, a trading center for many nations who visit it by land and sea. He was not exaggerating, and the ground has backed him up. Amber from the Baltic, wine in large jars from the Rhineland, millstones, heavy volcanic quernstones shipped hundreds of miles because the stone from that region ground grain better than anything local. Glass and metalwork from northern France and Germany, coins from a spread of kingdoms. Along with all the ordinary industry of a working town, loom weights by the score, antler being cut for combs, metalworking debris, pottery. So while the Roman city a mile east stood empty and overgrown, with trees in its amphitheater, a busy international port was running on a beach just upstream, full of weavers and smiths and shipmen speaking half a dozen languages. Two Londons, a mile apart, one of them silent. That arrangement lasted about 250 years. Then ships of a different kind came up the Thames. The raids began in the 830s, and they got worse. In 842, a chronicler recorded an attack on London and called it the Great Slaughter. 9 years later, another raiding force arrived, reportedly with 350 ships. I will not linger here. It is very long ago, and everyone in it has been at peace for more than 1,000 years. But consider Londonwick's problem, plainly. It was a wealthy trading town sitting on an open beach with no walls at all. Everything that made it successful, the easy landing, the openness to the river, the absence of fortification, was exactly what made it impossible to defend. Trade routes broke down, fires swept the settlement, and by the 880s, Londonwick had been abandoned. By then, the Vikings had already spent a winter somewhere in the area, and there is a fair chance they spent it camped inside those empty Roman walls, which had been standing unused for 400 years. Somebody had finally found a use for them. Then, in 886, Alfred of Wessex moved the people back inside. He was building fortified towns across southern England, and London was an obvious candidate, because the walls, astonishingly, were still there. 4 centuries of neglect, and they were repairable. The Romans had built them that well. So the walls were mended, the defensive ditch outside was recut, and the settlement inside got a new name, Lundenburg, Fortress London. That is the moment the city of London begins, the square mile whose boundaries still roughly follow those ancient walls today. But here is the detail that survives underfoot, and it is my favorite thing in this whole stretch of the story. The Roman street grid was gone, not damaged, gone. 400 years of overgrowth and soil had erased it so completely that when people came back, they could not follow it. So they laid out new streets, in new places, going where it made sense to them. Those Saxon streets are the ones still there, which means that when you walk through the city of London today, past the glass towers, you are walking a plan drawn up in the 9th century by people rebuilding inside a ruin, working around obstacles that vanished 1,000 years ago. The bends and kinks and awkward little lanes are not Roman, they are Alfred's. Almost every street name in that square mile is Old English. And Lundenwick, the busy beach town, the emporium of many nations, 2.5 centuries of ordinary life, got nothing. No monument, no ruin. It was timber and wattle, and timber and wattle go back into the soil. It got one thing only. As the population moved east behind the walls, the old settlement was left behind, and people began calling it Ealdwick, the old town, the former place. Say that name out loud for 1,000 years and it wears down into Aldwych. So there is a road in central London named after a town that was abandoned 1,200 years ago, by people who could still remember it, and the name simply never got taken down. The buses stop there. It is on the maps and in the announcements, said aloud thousands of times a day by people getting off at Aldwych with absolutely no idea they are saying the old town. That is the quiet trick this city plays. It rarely commemorates anything deliberately. It just forgets to throw the name away. Down on the Strand, the beach is gone, embanked, walled, buried under road. The gravel ridge to the east has kept rising. Somewhere above the river, on a street laid out by 9th century hands around obstacles nobody can see, a candle burns in a window and goes out. Bells now, though, not many yet. That will change. Within 300 years, this city will have more than 100 churches in it, and they will all ring at once. Part 5. 126 bells. Around the year 1174, a clerk named William Fitzstephen sat down to describe his city, and left behind a number that stops you. 126 parish churches, plus 13 larger churches belonging to monasteries and religious houses. 139 churches, in a city that probably held no more than 40,000 people. Work that through and it becomes almost absurd. That is a church for every 300 inhabitants. Almost every street had one. You could not walk for 2 minutes in any direction without passing a church door, and the parish you were born in was your address, your welfare office, your social circle, and your identity all at once. But the number that matters is not really the churches. It is the bells. Every one of those churches had a bell, and they were not decorative, they were the clock. There were no public clocks in London for most of the medieval period. There were no clocks in houses at all. What there was instead was sound. The bells for services, marking out the hours of the monastic day. Bells for weddings, bells for funerals, the bell for curfew at nightfall. So the city told itself the time by ringing, from 139 directions at once, all slightly out of step with each other. At noon, they overlapped into something that must have been extraordinary. A great uneven bronze weather rolling across the rooftops, near ones sharp and clear, far ones arriving a half-second late and softened by distance. People could tell them apart. You knew your own parish bell the way you know a family member's footsteps on the stairs. You could stand in a strange part of the city and locate yourself by which bells you could hear. And the last one of the day had a specific job. The evening bell was the curfew, and the word tells you exactly what it meant. Couvre-feu, cover the fire. At the sound of it, you were to bank down your hearth, cover the embers, damp them, make them safe for the night. The city gates closed, the taverns emptied. If you were out after that, you needed a lantern and a decent reason. This was not about behavior, it was about survival. London was built of timber and thatch and wattle and daub, packed so tightly that upper stories jutted out over the street and nearly touched the houses opposite. Every home had an open fire. Every workshop had candles or rushlights. A 13th century law required new roofs to be slate or tile rather than straw, and it was widely ignored. So every night at the bell, 40,000 people covered their fires and shut their shutters. And every night, statistically, that mostly worked. Mostly. The wonder is not that medieval London burned regularly, it is that anything at all survived from one century to the next. Then the darkness, which is difficult to imagine now. No street lighting, none at all. And overhead, those overhanging upper floors leaning in from both sides, so even moonlight barely reached the ground. If you had to move through the city at night, you carried a lantern, and the light of it went perhaps 3 or 4 feet before it gave up. Beyond that, nothing. Mud underfoot, uneven, with a channel running down the middle of the street carrying whatever the day had produced. Sound became the whole world, your own footsteps, a shutter somewhere, a dog, the river, if you were near enough. And in the houses, behind those shutters, people were doing what people do at night, which is mostly sleeping in rooms full of other people, because a household was not just a family. It was the family, plus apprentices, plus servants, plus lodgers, all under one roof, sleeping in rooms that had been a workshop that afternoon and would be a workshop again at dawn. Rooms did not have purposes, they had shifts. In daylight, the trick to navigating the city was that the streets told you what they sold. Bread Street, Milk Street, where cows were kept for milking, Honey Lane, Wood Street, Ironmonger Lane, Poultry, Threadneedle Street for the tailors, the Shambles for the butchers, from an Old English word for a bench or stall, and now, thanks to what happened on those benches, a word meaning a scene of blood and disorder. This was not organic, it was law. Trades were required to cluster, partly for supervision, goldsmiths together where they could be watched, and partly to keep the worst of it away from everyone else. Tanners, whose work involved urine and lime and made a smell that carried, were pushed out to the city's edge. So the map of medieval London was a set of instructions. You did not need an address, you needed a trade. The names are still there, most of them. People eat lunch on Bread Street and buy shoes on Poultry. But you would not have needed to read the names anyway. Almost nobody could. Instead, the city hung its signs above your head in pictures. A golden key for a locksmith, a boot for a shoemaker, 3 balls, a bush, a bunch of grapes, a hand, a cradle, a whole vocabulary of shapes swinging on iron brackets over the street, each one a word that could be understood without letters. Bakers had their loaves visible. Fishwives shouted. Prices were called aloud rather than written up. The entire commercial life of the city was designed for an audience that could not read a syllable, and worked perfectly well that way. Cheapside was where it all came together. Not a street in the modern sense, but a wide-open marketplace. Permanent shops along both sides, temporary stalls down the middle, packed on market days. Fitzstephen's word for the noise of it is essentially that everything in the world was available. Merchants calling, customers arguing, apprentices running errands badly, someone leading a horse through a crowd that did not want to move for it. And down by the river, something you would recognize instantly. A cook shop, open all hours. Fitzstephen describes it plainly. A public cook shop on the riverbank, among the wine ships and the cellars. You went in, you named what you wanted, you got it hot, and you took it away. He lists what was available, and it reads like a menu. Roast, fried and boiled meat, fish large and small, coarser food for the poor, and finer for the wealthy, whatever the season had. His argument for it is a good one. If a friend arrives unexpectedly, and they are tired and hungry, and you do not want to make them wait while bread is baked and meat is prepared, you go to the riverbank, and it is already done. That is a takeaway. In the 1170s. Open at any hour of the day or night, serving a city where most kitchens were small, fuel was expensive, and lighting a cooking fire was an ordeal. 900 years later, this city still runs on the same principle. Somebody else has already lit the fire. You just have to walk down to the river. The other thing everybody needed was water, and getting it was somebody's whole day. Wells throughout the city, the Thames itself. And from the 13th century, the great conduit, fresh water piped in lead from springs outside the built-up area, running downhill into a stone cistern in Cheapside, where anyone could come and fill a vessel. That was a civic marvel, and it was treated like one. Water flowed from it at coronations and celebrations, occasionally wine instead. But a conduit does not carry water to your house. It carries it to a point in the street. So the getting of water was labor, done mostly by women and by professional water carriers, who made a living hauling it in tubs and tankards from conduit to door. Every wash, every pot of pottage, every brewing day began with somebody physically carrying the weight of it through a crowd. A household's water was measured not in taps but in journeys, and crossing the river was one crossing for 500 years. The stone London Bridge was begun in 1176 and finished in the early 1200s, and it became the most extraordinary structure in the city because they built on it. Houses, shops, 3 and 4 stories, timber-framed, crowded along both sides and leaning out over the water, some of them meeting overhead so that in stretches you were passing through a tunnel. There was a chapel in the middle of it, shops selling cloth and shoes at ground level. Families who lived their entire lives on a bridge, born and married and buried, without ever properly having an address on land. Underneath, the piers were so wide and so numerous that they choked the river into narrow gaps, and the water tore through them in a rush you could hear from the buildings above. And for more than 500 years it was the only bridge. The next one would not come until the 1700s, which is why, if you actually wanted to get across, you generally did not use it. You took a boat. The bridge was so congested, carts, animals, shoppers, the crowd of a permanent shopping street laid across the only crossing in the city, that it was very often quicker to walk to the water's edge, stand at the stairs, and call for a wherry. So the Thames filled with watermen. Thousands of them, eventually, small boats crossing and recrossing, rowing people upstream and down, shouting for custom at the water stairs. The river was not an obstacle in the city. It was the main road through it, and the smoothest one, in an age when land travel meant mud and ruts and a real chance of being robbed. The bells kept the hours, the tide kept its own, and in the coldest winters both would stop mattering, because the water itself would go still and hard, and Londoners would walk out onto the middle of their river. The candle in the window, on its street, on the old gravel ridge, hooves on wet stone below, and the last bell of the evening, telling the whole city to cover its fires. Sleep well tonight. Nothing needs banking down. Part 6. Winter on the water. Between the 1600s and the early 1800s, the Thames froze solid 24 times. Not a skin of ice at the edges. Frozen through, hard enough to hold crowds, carts, horses, tents, printing presses, and open fires, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. Three things made it possible, and only one of them was the weather. The winters were genuinely colder. This was the long, cool spell often called the Little Ice Age. But the river was also a different river, wider than it is now, and shallower, spreading out where embankments have since squeezed it in. And then there was the bridge. All those piers, crowded across the channel, slowing the water almost to a standstill above them. Slow, shallow, wide, cold. The river was practically being asked to freeze. So it did, and the city, deprived of its main road, simply moved out onto it. They had been skating here long before that. In the collection of the London Museum, there are ice skates made from animal bone, dating back to the 1100s, the leg bones of cattle or horses, ground flat on one side, with holes bored through for a strap. You tied them to your shoes, and then, since a bone runner has no edge to push against, you propelled yourself with a pole, pushing at the ice between your feet and gliding. Fitzstephen watched young Londoners doing exactly this on the frozen marshes north of the city, and described them going as fast as a bird in flight. He also described them crashing into each other, deliberately, at speed, with poles, which he seems to regard as the natural conclusion. Cattle bone, a leather strap, a stick, and a frozen marsh in the 12th century. Some pleasures do not need to be invented, they only need weather. The first proper frost fair on the record came in the winter of 1607 into 1608. It began as pure practicality. The river was the highway. The river had stopped working, and the boatmen were out of work, so people started walking across instead, and the traders followed the people, because a crowd is a crowd wherever it happens to be standing. Very quickly, it stopped being practical. By the time the fair was properly underway, there were football matches on the ice, bowling, stalls selling food and drink, pork roasting over coal fires kindled directly on the frozen surface of a river, with the water still moving somewhere underneath. That is the image that stays with me. An open fire, on the Thames, with a crowd around it warming their hands, and a foot or two of ice between the flames and the current. Every frost fair afterwards followed that same shape. Necessity first. Then somebody sets up a stall. Then somebody lights a fire. Then it becomes the most exciting thing that has happened all year. The greatest of them ran through the winter of 1683 into 1684 and lasted about 2 months. The diarist John Evelyn went out onto it and called it a carnival on the water. There were whole streets of tents and booths, barbers working on the ice, shoemakers, booksellers, taverns knocked together from canvas and timber, selling gin and wine and something quite new to London, coffee, hot, in a cup, in the middle of a frozen river. There were games and bowling and sledging and skating. There was hunting. There were coaches, actual horse-drawn coaches, driving about on the surface. And there were printers. Somebody dragged a printing press out onto the ice, set it up, and sold souvenir cards to order. You gave them your name, they printed it, with the date, and the words recording that it had been printed on the frozen Thames. King Charles II walked out and bought one. Those souvenir cards are the detail I find hardest to let go of. They are not grand. They are small printed slips, produced in enormous numbers, cheap, sold to anybody who fancied one. The 17th century equivalent of a fridge magnet. And people kept them. Decades later, they were still in drawers, in boxes, tucked into books. Because the thing about a frost fair is that you might live your whole life and see one, or none, or two if you were lucky, and you could never plan for it. So a slip of paper with your own name on it, and a date, and the fact that you had stood on the river. I was there. The water was hard. I walked on the Thames. Some of those cards still exist. The ice they were printed on melted 340 years ago and went out to sea, and the paper is still here. Not everyone was celebrating, and it is worth saying so. The watermen, the thousands of men who made their living rowing people across, lost everything the moment the river set. Their boats sat frozen in place. Their entire trade stopped. In the Great Freeze of 1621, which held for 8 weeks, some of them took a practical view of the situation. They stood at the water stairs, where people came down to step onto the ice, and charged them for the privilege. The reasoning, as they saw it, was sound. The river was their workplace. Whether it was liquid or solid was not really the point. Meanwhile, fuel prices climbed, and the brewers and bakers and washerwomen struggled without running water, and the coal smoke of a freezing city sat over the frozen river in a thick gray lid. The fair was a bright thing on a very hard season. Both were true at once. They usually are. Then the fair stopped, and it was not only the climate that ended them. The last one was in January of 1814. An elephant was walked across the ice below Blackfriars, which feels like an appropriate way for a 200-year tradition to sign off. The winters did grow milder as the century went on, but London also changed the river itself. The old medieval bridge, the one with the houses, the one whose crowded piers had been damming the flow for 6 centuries, was replaced in 1831 by a new bridge with only 5 arches. The water could move freely again. Then came dredging, and the embankments narrowing and deepening the channel until the Thames ran faster and colder and far too quick to set. So the frost fairs did not simply fade out. They were engineered out by a city solving other problems entirely, with no idea it was abolishing its own strangest festival. Now go back a couple of centuries, to the South Bank, to the district those fairs looked across at. Bankside, Southwark, outside the city walls, and that is the whole point of it. The City of London had authority within its boundaries, and in 1574 it banned the building of playhouses in the center, so the playhouses went where the rules did not reach, north beyond the walls in Shoreditch, and south across the river in Southwark. Which is why, in the 1570s and after, the entertainment district of London grew up on the far bank, mixed in among bear-baiting rings and taverns and everything else the authorities preferred not to have inside their jurisdiction. You crossed the water to see a play. That crossing was part of the evening, a wherry over, in the afternoon light, toward a cluster of tall, round timber buildings, with flags flying to show a performance was on. You could see the flag from the north bank. That was the advertisement. Inside, the arrangement was unlike almost anything before it. The rows held around 500 people standing in the open yard around the stage, with room for 1,100 more in 3 tiers of covered galleries. A penny got you into the yard, on your feet, in the weather. More money got you a seat, under a roof, higher up. Which meant that a laborer and a merchant's wife and a young lawyer were all in the same building at the same time, watching the same play, separated by pennies and altitude, but breathing the same air. In a society as rigidly ordered as that one, this was genuinely unusual. Performances started at around 3 in the afternoon, because they depended on daylight. There was no artificial lighting worth the name. When the light went, the play was over. Every performance was a race against the sun going down behind the roof. The Globe was built in 1599, and the way it got there is one of the better stories in the history of the English stage. The company had a playhouse in Shoreditch called the Theatre, and a dispute with the landlord over the ground it stood on. Their reading of the lease was that the land was his, but the building was theirs. So in late December of 1598, while the landlord was away, they took it apart, beam by beam, in the winter dark, with a carpenter directing. They carried the timbers off, stored them, and used them the following year to build a new playhouse across the river on Bankside. The Globe was made out of a dismantled theater, moved by hand, in secret, in the cold. Which means that when the audience stood in that famous wooden O, they were standing inside recycled material, the very same beams that had been holding up a stage 2 miles away a few months earlier. Nothing in this city ever really gets thrown away. It just gets carried somewhere else and put up again. Both those playhouses vanished so completely that for centuries nobody knew precisely where they had stood. Historians argued over it, on paper, for generations. Then, in 1989, in the same year, the foundations of the Rose and part of the Globe were found, chalk and brick and mortar under later buildings, exactly where the ground had been quietly keeping them. The theater in Shoreditch, the one they dismantled, turned up in 2008. The curtain was excavated between 2011 and 2016. 400 years of pavement, and there they were. The river outside runs too fast to freeze now. No fires on the ice, no printer taking down your name, no bone skates strapped over a shoe. But somewhere under Park Street, the foundations of a stage are still lying in the dark where they were laid, and above them, people are walking home, hooves on wet stone, bread not for hours yet. Rest here a while. Part 7. The Year of Smoke. Before any of it, there was a summer, and the summer was hot. 1665. London was the biggest city in the country by a very long way, crowded in behind its old walls and spilling well beyond them. And that year, the sickness that had come and gone for centuries came back one last time. I am going to move through this gently. It is 360 years ago. Everyone in it has long since come to rest, and there is nothing in the next few minutes that needs to trouble you tonight. What I want to show you is not the illness, it is what people did around it. Because the striking thing about that year, reading it now, is not the scale of the loss, it is how ordinary the surviving details are. Someone counting, someone leaving food at a door, someone writing down that the streets were very quiet, and finding that the quietness was the worst part. Those who could leave, left. The king and the court went first, to Hampton Court and then to Oxford. Parliament could not sit and moved out too. The courts followed. Most of the physicians and lawyers and wealthier merchants shut up their houses and went to the country, which was what you did, and had always been what you did. The people who stayed were the people who could not go, those with no country house, no relatives outside the city, no way of earning a living anywhere but here. The Lord Mayor stayed, the aldermen stayed, parish officials stayed and organized food for households that had been shut in. And this is where the numbers become interesting in a way that has nothing to do with the illness. Because London kept counting, every week, all the way through. The bills of mortality were printed weekly, parish by parish, listing how many had died and of what. They had been running for decades before this. They kept running through it. Somebody collected the figures, somebody set the type, somebody printed them, and people bought them and read them and worked out from the columns whether their own part of the city was better or worse this week. It is one of the earliest examples of a city watching its own health in something close to real time. The numbers rose through the summer and peaked in September. Then, slowly, they began to come down. By February, the king was back, which was the signal everyone had been waiting for, the official view that London was safe again. Samuel Pepys walked through it and wrote the line that has stayed with me more than any statistic, that the streets were empty and melancholy, and everybody was talking of who was ill and who was gone. Not the horror, the conversation. That is what he noticed. And then, the following autumn, the second thing. It began in a bakehouse on Pudding Lane, in the small hours of a Sunday morning at the start of September. Pepys's maid woke the household at 3 a.m. to say there was a fire in the city. He got up, went to a window, looked at the glow, decided it was far enough away, and went back to bed. That detail is the most human thing in the entire account. The most famous fire in the history of the city, and the most famous witness to it, looked at it and decided it could wait until morning. He was not being foolish. Fires happened constantly in a city of timber. You saw a glow, you judged the distance, you went back to sleep. By 7 he was up again, and it looked smaller. By the time his maid came back to tell him 300 houses were gone, it had already reached the river. What made it unstoppable was not the flame, it was the weather and the shape of the streets. There had been a long drought. Everything was dry. Timber, thatch, the pitch and tar stored along the waterfront, the warehouses of oil and wine and brandy near the river. And a strong wind was blowing steadily from the east, pushing the fire straight into the heart of the city. The houses leaned toward each other across narrow lanes, their upper stories nearly meeting overhead. Fire did not need to cross the street. It only needed to reach. The way to stop a fire like that was to pull down houses ahead of it and starve it of anything to burn. Everyone knew this. It was standard practice. The decision was slow in coming, and by the time it came, the fire was moving faster than men with hooks and ropes could work. The Lord Mayor met in the street that first day, exhausted, a handkerchief round his neck, said something almost anyone would recognize. The fire overtakes us faster than we can do it. Down at the waterside, the city was trying to save its belongings. Everything that could be carried was being carried. Goods went into carts, onto backs, into boats. The Thames filled with lighters and wherries piled with household possessions, people rowing out into the middle of the river with their lives stacked around them. And Pepys, watching this, noticed something odd and wrote it down. Hardly one boat in 3, he said, that had a household's goods in it, but there was a pair of virginals in it. A virginal is a small keyboard instrument, a domestic thing, not a valuable instrument, a normal one, the kind a middle-class family might have in a parlor. So in the middle of a catastrophe, with time to save only what mattered, an enormous number of London families looked around their homes and chose the music. Not the furniture, the instrument. There are 2 animals in the record of that fire, and both of them come from the same observer, and they are the details that people remember longest. The pigeons would not leave. They had nested in the eaves and around the balconies of the houses, and as the fire came, they hovered at the windows, unwilling to abandon the places they lived, until their wings caught and they came down. And afterwards, in the ruins of the Royal Exchange, a cat was found alive in a hole in the chimney, in the wall, the hair burnt entirely from her body and still living. I have thought about that cat more than is reasonable. Everything around her had gone. The greatest commercial building in the city, the pillars, the statues, the ledgers, the whole apparatus of London's money. And in a gap in the masonry, a small animal had found the one place where the stone was thick enough and simply waited. Somebody pulled her out. Somebody bothered. The fire burned for 4 days, and the accounts of the aftermath are full of very small human things. Pepys walked out across it while the ground was still hot enough to burn through his shoes, and picked up a piece of glass that had melted and buckled with the heat until it curled like parchment. He kept it, a souvenir. Out at Moorfields, in the open ground beyond the walls, the people who had lost their homes were camped in the fields, an enormous number of them, sleeping outdoors with whatever they had carried, and he noted the prices. A plain penny loaf was now costing 2 pence. That is the whole of human nature in one line. The city is still smoking, thousands are sleeping in a field, and someone has doubled the price of bread, and someone else has noticed and written it down and been disgusted. Both of those people are London too. Here is the part nobody can explain, and it has never been settled. The official record of deaths in the Great Fire is 6. 6 in a fire that destroyed 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and the cathedral, and left something in the region of 100,000 people without homes. Nobody believes it. The curators who work on this say plainly that there must have been more. The bakery's own maidservant, too frightened to climb across the roof with the rest of the household, is generally counted as the first to die, and she is not in that number. The likeliest explanation is administrative rather than miraculous. The parish clerks who recorded deaths had lost their own parishes. The dead in a fire like that may leave very little for a clerk to record, and the poor, the transient and the unnamed had always been counted least carefully. So the true figure is simply not known and will not be. A city that counted every week, straight through the previous year, could not count this. Then it was rebuilt, and it was rebuilt fast, and it was rebuilt in brick. New building codes favored brick and stone over timber. Streets were widened in places. Wren's churches went up across the skyline, and the new St. Paul's rose over Ludgate Hill on the old gravel ridge where the ground had first been dry enough to build on, 1600 years earlier. There is a comfortable story that the fire ended the plague by burning out the rats. It is not true. The deaths were already falling before the fire started, and the fire never reached most of the crowded parishes outside the walls where the illness had been worst. Nobody at the time made the connection either. It was invented later, because we prefer disasters to mean something. Why the plague ended, honestly, is still not fully understood. Some things this city simply does not explain. It rebuilds and moves on, and leaves the question in the ground. Within a few years, the streets were full again. New brick fronts on old plot lines. The same lanes, mostly, following the same medieval curves, because people rebuilt on the ground they owned, and property lines are more durable than buildings. Bread was being baked before dawn again on Pudding Lane and everywhere else, because that is when the ovens are lit, and that had not changed since the Romans. And beneath the new brick, in the ground, another layer went down. Charcoal and ash and melted glass, pressed flat by the weight of what came after, joining the burnt layer from the year 60 and every other stripe of ruin in between. 6 meters of days. The bell in the fog, the candle in the window, the river going out and coming back, indifferent as ever. Sleep now. Part 8. Under the streets. There are rivers under London. They are still there. They are still flowing tonight. The Fleet, the Walbrook, the Tyburn, the Westbourne, the Effra, and a dozen smaller ones with names that survive only on old maps. Every one of them once ran in daylight, through fields and gardens and marsh, down to the Thames. They were not filled in. You cannot fill in a river. Water that has been finding its way downhill for 10,000 years will go on finding it. So they were roofed over instead. Bricked, arched, buried, and given a new job. Walk almost anywhere in central London, and at some point the pavement dips slightly, then rises again, and you think nothing of it. That is a valley. There is a river at the bottom of it, 4 or 5 meters down, moving in the dark. You can hear one, in a few places, through a grating in a quiet street. The Fleet was the great one. It rose in 2 springs up on the high ground at Hampstead, and those springs still feed the ponds there, the Hampstead ponds on one side of the hill, the Highgate ponds on the other. People swim in them all summer. That is the head of the buried river, out in the open, with ducks on it. The 2 streams joined at Camden and ran south through what is now King's Cross, down a deep valley, into the Thames near Blackfriars. In its good centuries, it was wide and tidal at the mouth, wide enough for boats, with a mill working at the bottom of it in Roman times. And along its banks were wells, so many that the river had a nickname, the River of Wells. Chalybeate Springs, iron-rich water, believed to heal. St. Chad's Well, Bagnigge Wells, the Clerk's Well, which gave its name to Clerkenwell and is still there behind glass. People came out from the city to drink the water and sit by it. Then the city grew, and the river was downhill of everything. That is the whole story, really. Waste from the slaughter yards, waste from the tanneries, household waste, chamber pots, everything a growing population produces, all of it going into the nearest moving water, which carried it away and therefore seemed solved. By the 13th century, the Lower Fleet had another name, the Fleet Ditch. Jonathan Swift wrote a few lines about what came down it in a storm, and they are not lines I need to repeat at this hour. Dead animals, and the sweepings of butchers' stalls, and mud. The land around it became cheap. Cheap land near the city is where you put the things nobody wants near them, so the prisons went there. Newgate, Ludgate, the Fleet, Bridewell, all in that valley. A river of healing wells at one end, a river of prisons at the other, the same water. Christopher Wren tried to save it. After the fire, in all the rebuilding, he took the lower stretch of the Fleet and turned it into a canal, widened, straightened, faced with stone, with wharves along both sides for unloading coal, and 4 ornamental bridges crossing it. The model was Venice. That was the ambition, plainly stated. A grand water street, running up into the heart of the rebuilt city. It failed almost immediately, because everything upstream was still going into it, and no amount of stonework changes what arrives from above. The canal silted, it choked, it stopped being navigable. People fell into the mud along it and did not get out. Within about 50 years they began covering it over, and by the 19th century, the last of it was gone underground for good. You can walk the whole route now, above it, on ordinary streets. Farringdon Road runs down the valley floor. Above ground, the city's arrangements were older than anyone wanted to admit. Most houses had a cesspit, a pit under or behind the building, and when it filled, you paid the night soil men to empty it, which they did after dark, by hand, by candlelight, and carted the contents out to the market gardens beyond the edge of the city, where it was sold as manure. That was the system. It had worked more or less for centuries, because London had been small enough for it to work. By the middle of the 19th century, there were around 200,000 cesspits in London, and well over 2 million people. And then something arrived that broke it completely, and it arrived disguised as an improvement: the flushing toilet. Because a flushing toilet does not make waste disappear, it sends it somewhere else, immediately, in water. And the drains it went into ran, as everything here always has, to the river. Then came the summer of 1858, which was extremely hot and very dry. The Thames dropped. What had been in the water was left on the banks, and it baked. They called it the Great Stink, and the accounts of it are almost comic in their misery. People kept their windows shut in a heat wave. Curtains and blinds were soaked in chloride of lime and hung over the openings to try to block it, so that houses smelled instead of the chemical. The Queen attempted a pleasure cruise on the river and turned back within minutes. And Parliament, which had just finished building itself a magnificent new home directly on the riverbank, sat through the whole thing with the windows behind them and their curtains treated with lime and the smell coming up off the exposed mud outside. They had been discussing the sewage question in committees for years. The bill passed in 18 days. The engineer was Joseph Bazalgette, and he made one decision that matters more than all the rest. He worked out the volume the system would need to carry. He calculated it carefully for the population London had. Then he doubled the diameter of the pipes. His reasoning was simple, and he said it out loud: "We are only going to do this once." That single choice is why his sewers are still working. London's population doubled again in his own lifetime, and the system took it. It took the century after that. Millions of people use it every day now, 150 years on, through brick tunnels built by men who were paid by the day and never knew what they were building for. He insisted on Portland cement, which sets hard and resists water, and he had it tested obsessively, batch after batch, rejecting what failed. The most durable thing anyone built in the 19th century was a drain. The lost rivers were folded into it. That is what happened to the Fleet, and the Tyburn, and the Westbourne, and the rest. They were lined, arched over, and joined into the network. Natural streams turned into the plumbing of a city. The main sewers had to run somewhere, so Bazalgette built embankments along the Thames to hold them: the Victoria Embankment, the Albert, the Chelsea. He walled the river in, ran the sewers inside the wall, and filled in behind. It reclaimed something like 20 acres of land from the water. And into that same structure, because the space was there, he put an underground railway. So when you ride the District Line along the North Bank, you are traveling inside a wall that was built to hold a sewer, on ground that used to be river. The Thames is narrower now than it has ever been. Faster, deeper, cleaner. It no longer freezes. All of that is the same project. And down on the foreshore, while this was being built, there were children in the mud. They were called mudlarks. At low tide, they went out onto the exposed riverbed, barefoot mostly, and searched it. What they were looking for was not treasure. Coal, dropped from barges, bits of old iron, rope, bone, copper nails that had washed out of the shipyards, which were the best find because copper paid better than anything else they were likely to get. They sold the coal to poor households nearby. The metal and rope went to the rag shops. If they found a tool, they would often take it to the sailors, who would trade them biscuit and meat for it. Henry Mayhew, who interviewed them, reckoned the average earnings at about 3 pence a day. They worked the tide. When it came in, they came off. Then they waited and went back down when it went out again. One of them, at least, got out. Mayhew mentions a boy, a mudlark, one of the poorest of the poor, who was helped by a friend of his into a job at a printer's. That is the whole note. A few words in a book about the London poor. No name I can give you. But think about it. From the foreshore at low tide, hands in the cold mud, hunting for copper nails, to a room with type in it and paper and regular work. Somebody noticed him. Somebody said, "I know a man who is hiring." That is how it usually happens, when it happens at all. Not a policy. A person mentioning someone's name to someone else. The rest of them went on working the tide until they were too old for it, and left nothing behind with their names on. The mud is still giving things up. People still walk the foreshore at low tide, with permits now, and what comes out of it is the whole city in miniature. Roman pottery, medieval pins by the thousand, clay pipe stems, Tudor buttons, Victorian halfpennies worn smooth. The same anaerobic mud that kept those Roman sandals whole has been quietly keeping everything else. Twice a day the water goes out and the bed of the river lies open for a few hours, and twice a day it comes back and covers it again. It has been doing this the entire time, before the sewers, before the bridge, before anyone gave the water a name. Somewhere above it, on the old gravel ridge, a light burns in a window and goes out. Under the streets, in the dark, the fleet is still running down from the ponds on the hill to the Thames, the way it has always gone. Nothing to do about it. It just goes. Part 9. Fog and Gaslight. Depict. The fog is the thing everyone pictures, and almost nobody pictures it correctly. It was not white. It was not romantic. It came in yellow and green, and sometimes a heavy brown, and Londoners called the worst of it a pea souper because of the color. That color was coal. Somewhere between 1 and 5 million people, over the course of the century, all burning coal in open fires, in millions of separate grates, plus the factories and the gasworks and the railways. The smoke went up, met the damp air sitting in the Thames Valley, and settled. It got into everything, into fabric, into lungs, into the stone of the buildings. Buckingham Palace blackened and began to crumble. The whole city turned slowly darker over decades, and people stopped noticing because it happened at the speed of a lifetime. Dickens said London was shabby by daylight and shabbier by gaslight. He was not being unkind, he was being accurate. In a real fog, the city stopped making sense. Sound came from the wrong directions. You could lose the far side of a street. People walked with a hand along railings to keep their bearings, and link boys carried torches ahead of those who could pay for guidance. Traffic went to walking pace, then to nothing. Buses were led by men on foot with lamps. And the strangest part, in the accounts, is how quiet it went. All the ordinary noise of the largest city on earth, muffled and thrown about, so you might hear a voice clearly from somewhere you could not locate, and hear nothing at all from the cart passing 10 feet away. People stayed in. Fires were built up higher, which of course made more smoke, which made more fog. The city produced its own weather, and then sat inside it, feeding it. Against that, the gaslight. Gas lamps had spread through London from the early part of the century, and they changed the night more completely than anything since fire itself. Before them, darkness had been genuine. After them, the main streets held a chain of soft yellow pools, 20 or 30 feet apart, with the dark still sitting comfortably in between. Gaslight is not like electric light, it moves. It has a slight breath to it, a faint hiss, and it throws a warm, unsteady color that makes shadows lean and shift as you walk past. And every dusk, a man came round with a long pole and lit them, one by one, working his street in order. Every dawn, he came back and put them out. You could set your evening by him. A figure at the end of the road reaching up and a light coming on. Then further along, another. Then the whole street, and he was gone round the corner. Under those streets, in 1863, London did something no city had done before. It put a railway underground. The first line ran between Paddington and Farringdon, down the Fleet Valley as it happens, following the buried river. And it was built by the simplest method available, which was to dig an enormous trench along the road, build a brick tunnel in the bottom of it, and put the road back on top. They called it cut and cover. It closed streets for years and demolished a great deal of housing, mostly poor housing, mostly without much ceremony. And the trains that ran in it were steam trains, steam locomotives, in a tunnel, under a city already full of smoke. There were ventilation openings, and the engines were designed to hold their steam where they could, and it was still, by every account, a thoroughly unpleasant way to travel. Nearly 40,000 people used it on the first day. They queued for it, in the smoke, because it was faster than the street. Above ground, the streets belonged to horses. Something in the region of 300,000 of them in London by the end of the century. Cab horses, omnibus horses, dray horses hauling beer and coal, delivery horses, private carriages. The whole city ran on animals, and it sounded like it. The constant noise of iron shoes on stone was simply the background of being alive here, so constant that when a household had someone seriously ill, they would put straw down on the road outside to muffle it, and everybody who passed understood what the straw meant. That is a detail I keep coming back to. No sign, no notice, just straw on the cobbles, and the whole street lowering its voice. Horses need feeding, stabling, watering, and they produce a great deal that must be cleared. Crossing sweepers worked the junctions all day, sweeping a clean path across the road for anyone who would give them a coin. That was a job. Thousands of people did it. And the city was enormous, and getting more so. 1 million people in 1800, over 5 million by 1900, the largest city in the world for most of that stretch, by a very wide margin. Most of the new arrivals came from the English countryside, walking or taking the train into a place with no room for them, and the housing that absorbed them was old, subdivided, and packed. But something else was happening at the edges at the same time, and it is the reason London looks the way it does now. The railways went out into the fields, and houses followed the railways. Villages that had been separate places, Hampstead, Islington, Clapham, Ealing, were reached, then joined, then swallowed. They kept their names and their high streets and their parish churches, and became parts of a single continuous city. That is why London still feels like 100 small towns pressed together. It is because it is. The people who lived through it recorded it in extraordinary detail, and one man walked round asking, Henry Mayhew interviewed street sellers, sweepers, mudlarks, bird catchers, sellers of cough drops and artificial flowers and boiled pig's feet, and wrote down what they said, in their own words, with what they earned and how they lived. It runs to volumes. It is the closest thing we have to hearing the 19th century street speak. And what comes through, more than the hardship, is the sheer specialization. People did not sell things generally. They sold one thing. There were men who sold only dog collars, women who sold only watercress, bought at market before dawn and gone by breakfast. An entire economy of people surviving on a single item and an 18-hour day. The city was so large that a person could make a living from one very small thing, if they did it every day, in the right spot, and knew their customers. There is a phrase that turns up in the accounts of the fog, and it is the one I find most restful, oddly. Home was where the fog stopped. You came in off a street where you could not see the far pavement, and shut the door, and the world reduced to one room with a fire in it, and a lamp and whatever tea there was. Outside, the largest city on earth, gone completely from view. Not far away, right there, 10 feet beyond the glass, 5 million people, and invisible. Inside, a small warm circle. People read aloud to each other in those rooms, because that is what you did with a long evening and one lamp. Somebody sewed, somebody dozed in a chair and was left to doze. The fog did that. It made everything small. It was killing them, of course. That is the part it took a long time to accept. The smoke and the damp air together were doing steady damage across the whole population, and the worst of it came much later, in the winter of 1952, when a cold, still few days trapped the coal smoke over the city in a fog so dense that buses stopped running and people could not see their own feet. Thousands died. It is now thought to be many thousands. And that, finally, was the end of it. The Clean Air Acts followed. Households moved to smokeless fuel, then to gas and electricity. The fires went out, one by one, across millions of grates. The fog simply stopped. Within a generation, the thing that had defined London for 2 centuries was gone, and children grew up who had never seen one. They cleaned the buildings afterwards. Under the black, the stone was pale gold all along. So that is the city, at its largest and its darkest, and then quietly lightening again. Gas lamps giving way to electric, steam under the streets giving way to current, the horses thinning out year by year, until, within 2 decades, they were simply gone, and the straw on the cobbles with them. There are still gas lamps in London. A few hundred of them, in the older streets and the courts and around the palaces, and there are still lamplighters who look after them. A handful of people, working a route, the way it has been done since before anyone can remember. You can find one in the evening if you know where to look. A soft yellow light with a little movement in it, and a hiss you have to stand close to hear. The fog is gone, the dark is not as dark as it was, and a light comes on above the old street, the way it always has. Rest now. There is one part left, and it is a quiet one. Part 10. What the City Keeps, 1 When the bombing began in September 1940, the government had already decided that people would not be allowed to shelter in the underground. The reasoning was practical. The tunnels were needed for transport. And there was a worry that if people went down, they might not come back up, that a whole population would settle underground and refuse to leave. Londoners disagreed, and they disagreed in the most London way imaginable. They bought tickets. A ticket entitled you to be on the platform. So they queued at the machines, paid their fare, went down the escalators, and then simply did not board any train. They sat down, they stayed. There was no march, no petition, just thousands of people holding a valid ticket and declining to leave. Within about 2 weeks, the authorities gave in. By the 21st of September, around 120,000 people were sleeping in the stations. Once it was official, it had to be organized, and the organizing is the part I love. Reservation tickets were issued so families could hold the same patch of platform each night and stop queuing for hours. Bunks went in, around 24,000 of them across the network. Laid end to end, they would have run for 27 miles. There were rules, posted and repeated. Arrive after 6:30, leave by 7 in the morning, keep away from the platform edge, don't stand in groups. Take your rubbish with you. Medical posts opened, 86 of them across the system. And there were problems nobody could have predicted. Mosquitoes, for one, breeding in the warm, damp air down there in numbers that became a genuine nuisance. The solution was spraying, with an instruction in the records that spraying might be paused while people were asleep, and should resume during what one report calls, with beautiful understatement, the coughing period in the morning. Every civilization is revealed by its paperwork. Then the canteens. The first refreshment service opened at the end of October 1940. By early December, there were 124 serving points across 71 stations, feeding something like 112,000 people a night. They ran until May 1945, and in those 4.5 years they served 545,454 gallons of tea. somebody counted. That is the thing. Through everything, somebody kept a running total of the tea. There was even a complaint, formally recorded and formally solved. The tea was going a strange color because the tannin in the leaves was reacting with the copper of the urns, and the shelterers were not having it. The fix was a small amount of citric acid in the water, bombs overhead, and a memo about the tea being off. What went on down there at night was not endurance exactly. It was ordinary life, relocated. People brought gramophone records and played them. Buskers came down. Someone would know a singer, and the singer would come and sing. There were about 25,000 children in the stations nightly at the peak, so there were children's parties. At Christmas there was carol singing, and paper chains strung along the tiled walls, and, by one woman's recollection, a great deal of knees-up Mother Brown. One station was turned over entirely into a library. Think of the sound of it. A curved tiled tunnel, which is more or less a perfect echo chamber, filled with a few hundred people singing, at Christmas, 400 feet from the surface. The trains still ran in the mornings. People woke on the platform, rolled up their bedding, and got on the 7 o'clock to work. Above ground, on the night of the 29th of December 1940, the city burned, and St. Paul's did not. There is a photograph of it, the dome standing above a floor of smoke, taken from a rooftop near Fleet Street. It ran in the papers 2 days later and became the most famous image of the war in Britain. But the reason the cathedral was still there is not in the photograph. It was a group of volunteers, the St. Paul's Watch, ordinary people, working shifts, day and night, so the building was never uncovered, patrolling the roof spaces and galleries with sandbags and stirrup pumps. Around 28 incendiary bombs hit the cathedral that night. Everyone was dealt with by that team. When bombs lodged in the roof timbers, volunteers crawled along smoldering beams to put them out. One lodged in the lead of the dome and began to melt it, then shifted, fell inside onto the floor of the stone gallery, and was smothered with a sandbag. Not a miracle. People on a roof, all night, with buckets. A woman called Dorothy Barton, an office worker, saw it the next morning and said something that has outlasted almost everything else written about that night. She said she felt a lump in her throat because, like so many people, she felt that while St. Paul's survived, so would we. That is the whole function of a building in the end. It is why the Romans put up a basilica in a mud port on the edge of the world, and why the Saxons called the ruins the work of giants, and why Wren spent 35 years on that dome after the fire. Not shelter, not even beauty particularly. Something to look at in the morning that is still there. And then the city did what it always does, which is build over the top. Some of the rebuilding was hurried, and some of it was poor, and some of it has already been knocked down in its turn. But the bomb sites did one accidental, enormous favor to everyone who came afterwards. They opened the ground. Before the war, London's ancient layers were locked under standing buildings. Afterwards, for the first time, archaeologists could get down into cleared sites across the city, and much of what we know about Roman and medieval London was found in those years, in gaps between ruins, often by people working fast, ahead of the builders. The Temple of Mithras came out of a bomb site in the 1950s and drew queues of 30,000 people a day, standing in line in the rain to look at a Roman foundation. The city keeps returning things, usually when something is being knocked down, which brings us back to where we started tonight, and to the pattern underneath all of it. The amphitheater, found in 1988 under the Guildhall. The Rose and the Globe, both found in 1989. 405 writing tablets out of the Walbrook mud, with the earliest handwriting in Britain among them. The first basilica, in February last year, in a third test pit dug between two filing cabinets in an office basement. Nobody went looking for most of it. It surfaced because a building came down, or a lease ran out, or somebody needed a deeper foundation. That is the arrangement this city has with its own past. It does not preserve things, it postpones them. Outro. So here is what we have been standing on all this time. One stretch of gravel above a wide dark river. Somebody chose it because the ground was firm. Everything else followed from that. The bridge, the wharves, the burning, the rebuilding, the emptying out, the coming back, the bells, the ice, the smoke, the tunnels. 6 meters of days, laid down one on top of another. The street is still there. It has been resurfaced 1,000 times, and on it, tonight, above a buried stream and a burnt layer and a Roman floor, there is a window with a light in it. Somebody is up late. Somebody always is. The bell comes through the fog, faint, from a church rebuilt after a fire that happened 360 years ago. Hooves on wet stone, long gone now, but the stones remember the shape of them, worn slightly hollow where the traffic went. And in a few hours, before the sky changes, an oven will be lit somewhere near the river, because that is when bread is started, and that has not altered since the year 57. None of them knew they were making a city. They were thinking about the week ahead, about deliveries and rent and whether the tide was right. You are the same. That is not a small thing to be. You are one more layer on the gravel above the river, on an ordinary night, with the light on. Sleep well. The river will still be going out and coming back in the morning.